Sometimes it wasn't that they didn't love you, it's that they never truly knew how to stay loyal to anything that required emotional depth. Because for some, betrayal isn't a mistake. It's a rhythm they've learned to dance to over and over again, without remorse. Welcome to Broken Truth, where love meets lies, and every story reveals the pain behind the smile. Not everyone betrays out of sudden temptation or accidental emotional drift. For some people, betrayal becomes a pattern behavior, rooted in their upbringing, past validation cycles, emotional detachment, or even the thrill of control. These individuals often move from connection to connection, not because they lack love, but because loyalty to them feels like a cage. They associate commitment with vulnerability, and rather than risk being hurt, they preemptively destroy intimacy before it can expose them. Over time, betrayal becomes their default escape, a habit they don't even recognize as destruction anymore. They weren't sure exactly when the doubt began to feel louder than the love. Maybe it was the way their messages started going unanswered, just a little longer than usual. Or the way the warmth in their partner's eyes dimmed too fast after a laugh. There was no fight, no cheating scandal, no dramatic end-of-the-road scene, just the slow erosion of effort, the quiet retreat of intimacy. It felt like being in a conversation where the other person had already emotionally left, but was still nodding politely. In the beginning, there were promises, always promises. "I'm not like the others," they had said. "You feel like home." And they had believed it, God. They had believed it with every soft, eager part of them that still hadn't learned not to hand their heart over on a silver plate. The attention came fast, intoxicating. The kind that made you feel chosen, special. And for someone who had always been patient in love, who never asked for more than honesty and presence, it was easy to mistake this urgency for something real. But real things don't run. What they didn't know then was that some people love like a mirror, only to reflect what you want to see, until they tire of holding it up. And when it became heavy, when emotional closeness asked for consistency, that mirror shattered. "I'm just not ready for something this deep," they said one evening after weeks of silence disguised as space. Funny how that line came after months of drawing them in. After building dreams and whispers and late night phone calls, after making them believe they'd finally found someone who wouldn't walk away when things got heavy. But maybe that's the cruelest thing about people who make betrayal a habit. They don't just leave. They unbuild you. They make you question why you weren't enough to be the exception. So they stayed longer than they should have, hoping the tide would change, hoping loyalty and love would rewrite a heart that only knew escape. But love isn't a rehabilitation center for broken people who don't want to change. And being patient with someone who keeps leaving doesn't make you noble. It makes you tired. It took them months to realize the pattern, the highs and vanishing acts, the sweet apologies and cold detachment, the cycle of closeness followed by emotional distance. At first, they blamed themselves. Maybe they were asking for too much. Maybe they were too sensitive. Maybe love was supposed to be painful, and this was just proof of how deep it ran. But then came the silence that didn't hurt. It numbed. The last time they were ghosted mid-conversation, something inside them stopped reaching, not because they didn't care, but because they finally understood. This wasn't new behavior, it was rehearsed. The person they loved had done this before and would do it again. They weren't falling out of love. They were just returning to a pattern, abandoning before being seen, hurting before being held too long, running the moment someone stayed. They remembered the late night stories the person told in the beginning, exes who were too clingy, people who didn't get them, relationships that ended because they didn't feel right. Now those stories made sense. They weren't warnings, they were confessions. And maybe they had ignored all of it because hope is louder when you're lonely. Still, when the final betrayal came, not with yelling, Not with final words, just with a vanishing so casual it felt routine. They didn't cry, they didn't scream, they stood still. Like someone who had just finished reading a sad book they always knew would end this way. Because it wasn't about what they lacked, it was about what the other person refused to grow into. Some people make betrayal a habit because loyalty demands presence, and presence demands effort. And effort is terrifying when you're not used to being emotionally responsible. They packed their things slowly, the kind of slow you move with, when you're not escaping, just finally accepting, and they left behind a small note on the table. It didn't ask for closure, it didn't beg to be chased. It simply said, I hope one day you stay long enough to see what you ruin. Then they walked out, not lighter, not healed, but at peace because they had finally stopped trying to fix what was never broken, just unwilling. They sat in the quiet for a long time. No dramatic weeping, no shaking hands. Just the steady rhythm of breath filling a space that had once been crowded with uncertainty. For the first time in months, they weren't waiting for a reply, an explanation, or a sign that maybe things weren't really over. They knew and more than that. They understood. It didn't hit like a wave. It arrived like a slow sunrise, a light warming their skin after a long season of gray. They started remembering things differently now, not through the lens of hope or the hunger to be loved, but with the honesty they had kept brushing aside, the way their partner always turned. Small concerns into guilt trips, the way apologies came too easily, like tools instead of truths, the way charm appeared right after every withdrawal, a cycle built to confuse, not to connect. They remembered the anxious waiting, the overthinking, the nights they twisted themselves into emotional knots just to make space for someone who never planned to stay long. And maybe the most painful realization of all, the way they had mistaken unpredictability for passion because no one had ever told them that chaos isn't love, that attention isn't intimacy, that emotional whiplash doesn't mean depth. It just means damage repeating itself. So they sat with all of it, not to blame themselves, but to see clearly healing didn't look like deleting old messages or throwing away gifts. It looked like reclaiming their own narrative with gentleness. It began in small ways, saying no without apologizing, resting without guilt, not explaining their worth to anyone, pausing before chasing after someone who pulls away, and most of all, learning to believe their own feelings again. They realized they had spent so much time second-guessing their gut. Every time they felt something was off, they were told it was their insecurity. Every moment they asked for reassurance was twisted into neediness. But now they understood their sensitivity wasn't the problem, it was the signal. So they began building boundaries, not harsh, not armored, just clear, not walls to push people away, but mirrors to reflect back what someone truly offers. Not just what they say. They didn't need to be harder, they just needed to be honest. The next time someone arrived with fast words and burning eyes, they didn't melt, they slowed down, they asked real questions, they watched for consistency. They let action speak louder than longing, and when someone didn't show up fully, they didn't try harder. They let go. Because healing wasn't about finding someone new to prove they were lovable. It was about becoming someone who didn't need to prove anything at all. Some days still hurt, some memories still lingered. That was okay, but they were no longer stuck. They had found peace, not in forgetting the betrayal, but in refusing to carry its weight as their own failure. Now, when they looked in the mirror, they saw someone whole, someone soft but steady, someone who no longer confused love with struggle, and maybe that was the real freedom, not in never being hurt again, but in knowing they'd never betray themselves to stay close to someone who couldn't love deeply. They smiled gently, not because everything was perfect, but because they were no longer lost. They were home, and it was within Some betrayals weren't personal, they were just patterns that finally reached you for more truths that sting but for you. Subscribe to Broken Truth.